Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for tonight's lecture with Professor and Chair of our Department of Architecture, Jose Castillo. An architect, planner, and educator, Jose comes to Cornell from Mexico City. While he's just beginning his first year at AAP and learning his way around the college and department, he brings a wealth of knowledge and experience as a guide, and all of us also to guide him. Before joining us at AAP, he taught extensively in Mexico, Spain, and the US, including at the Harvard Graduate School of Design and UPenn, Tulane, and the University of New Mexico. He has used his decades of practice as an architect and urban planner in Mexico to inform his approach to pedagogy, which emphasizes the clear lines of connection between the work in the studio to the larger world as a social and political project. In Mexico, Jose co-founded and co-directed A911, an award-winning architecture and planning office that takes research-based, multidisciplinary approach to architecture and urban design, mobility, multifamily housing, and urban planning projects that confront pressing issues from climate change to affordable housing. Transcending dominant development trends as well as the scale and scope of a given project, Jose's work reconsiders conventional thinking in architecture and urban planning to imagine and implement new ways of understanding and confronting challenges in our natural and built environments. Rethinking practice and conceiving of how, from concept to organization to materials to detail, bringing forward the potential and ever-present responsibility to make positive impact in our spaces and places in communities across an urbanizing world. As he himself has shared, the discipline of architecture and planning have an opportunity and a responsibility to reclaim and reimagine what makes them so unique, relevant, and meaningful on their own terms, and understanding their ripple effects vis-a-vis the world at large. Please join me in welcoming Jose tonight to speak at greater length and detail on his work and practice as a leading architect and planner, as well as share thoughts on some of what we can look forward to in the months and years ahead under his leadership as chair of the Department of Architecture.
Thank you, Mijin, for such a generous introduction. I'm going to turn this on. For those of you who were curious about the title of the lecture, you'll discover that after, and you are only here, you can leave after slide 10. For the rest, this can be the beginning of a conversation about how we understand architecture, design, planning, and pedagogy, and why I'm here and how I think I can contribute to this fantastic legacy that this institution has. In December of 1977, Elvis Costello played at Saturday Night Live when the Sex Pistols could not arrive from London because their manager did not get a visa. After 12 seconds of playing Less Than Zero, Elvis Costello stopped the song completely and started playing a different song. The original song had some kind of political content to it, which Elvis thought it would not have a resonance in the United States. After that, he was banned for 12 years from appearing in Saturday Night Live. So I do hope that this lecture or this concept of a lecture is not necessarily the way to be banned for my next lecture in 12 years. But I wanted to graft on this idea of the concept of a plan and look actually, because I believe that both when we talk about concepts or ideas, when we talk about plans, they're very much related to the disciplinary techniques and concerns that we have in design, architecture, and planning. Of course, concepts have to do with conceptions of the mind, thought, notions. principles or ideas, an idea of something or how it works. I was always interested in the concept of in conceptual art and the way that through a trick of representation, through a trick of both deconceptualizing but giving a new meaning to either words, facts, artifacts, you could produce a meaningful work of art. This is Joseph Kosuth, 1 and 3 chairs, a photograph of a chair, and the description of a chair. But in a similar fashion, and I'm thinking, we have a saying in Spanish, I will say the joke first in Spanish, is un carrito de hot dog es un carrito de hot dog, 100 carritos de hot dogs es una instalación. One hot dog cart is one hot dog cart. You put 100 hot dog carts together and you have installation art. If we think of Walter de Maria's work, and if we think of a 2-meter rod by 2 inches, and we think of a weight, matter, material, you put it in a different context, you organize it, you bring a kind of a material and a different relationship of the individual object, and you produce something magical. And this is what relevant ideas and this is what powerful ideas have the capacity of doing. And of course, plan is a far more contingent and even polemical word, in the sense that plan is a word that whose meaning depends on who grabs it, gets it, adapts it. And for architects, the architectural plan is probably the most important, or one of the most important terms we've historically used. A drawing or diagram drawn on a plane, and I won't get into kind of the particularities of what makes a plan. But for planners, a plan is a completely different thing. And a plan is about the process. A plan is about the decisions of how to do something in the future, or the set of actions that have been brought to as a way to do or achieve something. A plan, by the way, can be a plan. An urbanistic plan, such as in this work of art by Juan O'Gorman, a 17th century plan is being used by a worksman to think about the future of Mexico City. So it's a kind of a meta-understanding of why the plan can serve as part of the plan. But in its most architectural abstraction, we can imagine that the plan is the seed of the strongest and most powerful architectural ideas. I chose Aldo Rossi's plan for the San Cataldo Cemetery, but I could have chosen many others. And each of us has in their mind their probably the most powerful representation of an idea and how that gets engendered in the plan. If we take this to the one scale further up, and we think of Nolli's plan of Rome, a plan is simultaneously a fiscal device, a way of understanding the city, an understanding between figure and ground. And to actually, when I heard about Jen de los Reyes' future course on land, I immediately thought that we should do an evolution of the figure ground into the figure land. The idea that the way we look at the city, the way we read the city, should have a deeper understanding of what constitutes the ground today. And for those of you in the advisory council, I think that the work that Jennifer, Caroline, Emma, Felix showed us is kind of remarkable in that way of understanding an expanded notion of the ground, an expansion notion of the land. And of course, I use Collage City and Colin Rowe as a kind of a segue to this moment. Do you still do not have a plan? And the answer is, I have concepts of a plan. And I think it's, besides the involuntary humor, there's something very relevant and interesting in the fact that not only politicians, but I would say architects, planners, human beings have no plans, but they have concepts of a plan. Another US president, in this case Dwight Eisenhower, used to say that plans are worthless, but planning is everything. This actually relates more to the notion of how planners understand planning and how planners understand the plan. The idea that the process is a reason strong enough to believe in the idea that we should do it, a kind of a faith in the process. The outcome, whether the plan or the building, is probably less important and less interesting, at least for certain people within the discipline. But I wanted to connect it finally to William James. And this, and maybe if we could paraphrase James, we could say that there are no plans but plans in the making. Every drawing, every representation, every vision, every process we have is an act of things in the making. For those of you who know me from a few years back or only recently, one of my obsessions is how do we connect the worlds of architecture and the worlds of design and planning to broader agendas of thinking about the built environment, coming either from literature, from music, from film, from art. And in the case of, for those of you who are fans of Jonathan Franzen, I strongly believe that Franzen's novels are a way of thinking about cities, a way of thinking about environments, a way of thinking about relationships that happen through time in space, whether Philadelphia or Minneapolis, whether the coal mines of the Appalachians or St. Louis, Missouri, that's the 27th city. They are discourses about cities and discourses about space and discourses about the social politics of space. Cities are ideas. They create themselves and the rest of the world apprehends them or ignores them as it chooses. I was actually very happy that Detroit came up in the conversation today because the stories about cities and the stories we tell about cities are about creating that narrative of either success or temporary failures. With the exception of a few cases, Pompeii, to be most precise, cities do not disappear ever completely. And of course, ideas in a way are also some form of mirrors. Sometimes they're mirrors, sometimes they're glasses with different degrees of transparency. But in one of my favorite paintings by certainly my favorite painter, Caravaggio, the Narcissus, and if, for those of you who know the myth of Narcissus, Narcissus ends up dying obsessed with his reflection on the water. And he fails to heed to the voice of echo. And I actually like, the Greeks were damn smart in many ways of thinking about terms and ideas that remain relevant to our days. Because echo is about, we complain about echo in Milstein, but actually echo is about ways of hearing to the voices that get reflected in space. When we fail to hear to those voices, we actually may drown. Of course, narcissism, a term which is not a few times used to talk about and discuss about architects, an artist, less about planners, although there are a few I could think of. The idea of our obsession with our own image is simultaneously powerful enough to produce new to produce new ideas, but actually to envision new plans. Isaiah Berlin, which was from kind of from political philosophy, taking on the work of Archilochus, he has this amazing aphorism in a very short book, The Fox and the Hedgehog. And he says that the fox knows many things, but a hedgehog knows one big thing. And he describes writers that are hedgehogs and writers that are foxes. And to put it in the world of architecture, just to give an example, I think that Mies is probably the ultimate hedgehog, and probably Corb is the ultimate fox. But I think that beyond the idea of the multiplicities of work, the ways our brains operate to bring ideas and to conceptualize and to position ourselves vis-a-vis those ideas and vis-a-vis the world is a fundamental enterprise and one that requires individual choices. 3 days ago, I went in an absolute round of depression when I heard that Darren Acemoglu and James Robinson and a colleague of them received the Nobel Prize of Economics. I did not go into the bout of depression for that. I went into the depression by noticing that Darren Acemoglu has a Google Scholar rating of 175, which means that he has 175 academic articles that have been quoted at least 175 times. And he has been able to write about big ideas to the general public, and he has been able to write about innovative ideas to the discipline. And this idea and this capacity to operate in the whole end of the spectrum, I think is something that architects, planners, and artists should be more able to do. If anyone has an extra copy of this book, I'll pay good money for it, because I only have it in an illegal PDF. But Peter Eisenman, who's 93 years old and a Cornell alumni and a Cornell member of the faculty, wrote this amazing book, 10 Canonical Buildings. And he goes on to explain his notion of the canonical building. And he says a building implies a structure that it transcends its specific time and place, influencing subsequent generations of architects. The canon, and we can think of Harold Bloom here writing in literature, but actually the way that we construct canons is fundamental to the teaching of the discipline, but also to the transformation of the teaching of the discipline. This is a school, and I'm happy to hear that this amazing department in the history of architecture and urban development, Ezra, Pamela, Medina, and who am I forgetting, are doing an amazing job of transforming our canon, to bringing new narratives, to destroying the idols and creating new voices and bringing to the forefront ideas that the whole problem of the canon may be problematic. And of course, Eisenman was looking at 10 buildings that he found incredibly relevant and influential in the last stage of the 20th century. But probably more important than the relevance of the building is that each of those buildings is the ability to reflect on a particular moment in time and its relationship to buildings that preceded and those that follow. In a way, the canon operates along two axes. How the work of architecture operates in relationship to previous work of that architect, but how that work of architecture relates to the world and to the contingencies of our time. I think, and a few years ago, when I turned 50 in a kind of middle-age crisis, I submitted to a fellowship which I did not receive, called Towards the Middle Age Tentative Canon, in which I would be looking at 10 buildings which were influential, relevant to me in a way to think about our own work, but to also posit the idea that those works of architecture, even 50, 60, 80 years ago, they present fertile ground to ways to thinking about the architectural project, the urbanistic project. And there were certain, if not coincidence in the specific works, at least a coincidence in who do we find relevant to the way we operate. And I was, of course, interested in Kant, but not in his canonical projects, but maybe in a project that deals with our concerns about mobility. I was interested, of course, in learning from Las Vegas and SML Excel in a way that maybe publishing, as we saw a few weeks ago with Irma Boom's lecture, publishing is a way of producing a different kind of architecture. But also looking at buildings that usually do not appear in the canon, whether the hospitality projects of Ricardo Legorreta or even the projects of Manuel Solá Morales and Rafael Moneo in La Isla in Barcelona. And Robin Hood Gardens by Alison and Peter Smithson in 2017, when Saidee and myself, Saidee, my partner and wife, we spent a summer as part of the Richard Rogers Fellows, which was probably the last year before Robin Hood Gardens came down. And this is, and of course, this is a fabricated, let's say it's a picture very much taken with a purpose of someone who admires a couple being able to survive practicing together, which is crazy enough. It's crazy enough to be an architect. It's crazy enough to be two architects in the same family. It's crazy enough, which, by the way, I know a lot of people do here in this building. But it is also the possibility to look at this not from the nostalgic point of view, but actually through a lens of reflexivity, simultaneously admiring the possibilities of ambition, the possibilities of ideas such as the streets in the air, the ideas that modern architecture can resolve the problems of housing, and at the same time acknowledging the limits of those architectures. And I do think that that sense of reflexivity is what distinguishes a kind of a tentative canon, an idea that our thoughts about architecture are not definite, but they're, again, things in the making or canons in the making. And we sometimes believe that our own autobiographies or our own biographies, or as they say, origin is destiny, is condition us to our particular choices. But rather than just the biography itself, and I will talk a little bit about what brings me here and what interests me at this particular moment in time and in this particular biography, it's actually trying to make sense as both a looking back and saying what happened where and what connected to something. And I have this strange feeling that somewhere in between the absolutely planned and controlled and the absolutely isolated and anecdotal, there are histories and there are stories to be told. The connecting the dots, the kind of crazy post-its plus pins on a corkboard that we sometimes do to make sense of things is a necessary act of creatively thinking and critically thinking about our own production. But it also allows us to make connections that maybe just become, maybe are just anecdotes, or maybe they are signs of something different. On the first week of my first year of architectural education in 1989, the first building that we were told to draw and do a model was the Marburg housing project by Oswald Matthias Ungers. I was born in 1969, which was the year that Ungers arrived here at Cornell. I'm not too obsessed about numbers, but I found it, and I actually went back through the historical archive of photographs, and I would be lying if I told you that this is my model from 1989, but it is Saidee's model, which tells that Saidee was a much better architect day one, and she preserved her photographs of that model. And for someone to week one of architectural education, someone actually telling you about this German guy, Oswald Matthias Ungers, about a project in unbuilt in Marburg, Germany, and to actually understand isometric representation and to understand so many of the lessons embedded in idea of form, typology, variation, it becomes an incredible asset for the rest of your life. Actually, when you arrive in a place like this and say, a kind of eureka, a kind of reckoning of those ideas. And as I was looking with envy at the first year student, and I think the advisor, the first year students and Caroline introducing the course, I could not feel but an envy to be young and to actually be 6 weeks into that course and learning to do the amazing work that studio is doing. But Ungers was a kind of my 6-week intro. And the other building that we got to do a model and drawings and representations was Stirling and James Godwin's Leicester Engineering building, an amazing work of architecture. And this is a building that came, I will return to in a second, but I think that has a kind of connection, a strange connection to Ungers, but also a strange connection to architectural discourses that were relevant or have been relevant and will continue to be relevant, at least for me in the past 30 years. But going back to anecdotes, in the past few lectures, I've seen efforts at humor, some of them successful jokes, some of them deliberately bad dad jokes. But my joke is myself with hair next to a picture with Philip Johnson, and one during my first year at the GSD in 1993 at a final review under Rafael Moneo's studio. And I can say this with a kind of confidence that after an initial round by the reviewers, and this was a different time when professors and reviewers could take certain liberties that are maybe frowned upon right now. But Jack Herzog, after comments by Stan Allen, who's back there, and Gabriel Ruiz Cabrero, Jack Herzog said something along the lines of, I don't get it. Everything, absolutely everything in this project is wrong. And it was a brutal, it was a massacre, and nothing short of a massacre. A kind of a massacre that one could say produces, or we used to say that produces character, but which we now know that is not necessarily the best pedagogical device to produce character. And with the generosity that always characterized him, Rafael Moneo threw the life jacket and brought me safely back home and bringing in the qualities of that project. But I think, and today during the advisory council meeting, we talked about representations and the way that drawings and models and the way that we present and the techniques and the tools that we use to convey architectural arguments. And sometimes we use visual devices, sometimes we use material devices, sometimes we use verbal devices. Fast forward 1 year, and during the studio that Saidee was taking with Enrique Miralles in a trip down to Princeton from Boston, we decided to stop over in New Canaan to try to see if we could visit the glass house, at that time not accessible to the public. So we go into the car, go down the driveway, like trespassing. So I think that sometimes trespassing can be an interesting architectural device for finding the most interesting architectures. I strongly encourage you to do it with care. But as we were kind of 50 feet into the property, someone comes out and says, no, it's private property, you need to go out. So on the way, we go down in front of the house and back up again. And Philip Johnson comes out of the pavilion he was building at the time. And he says, come on out, come on out. So we park the car and we spent half an hour with Philip Johnson, talking about everything from Luis Barragan to Harvard, which he found a reactionary place. But after those 30 minutes, the three of us were already visualizing ourselves having breakfast with Philip Johnson in the glass house. And when it came time to pop the question, I said, Mr. Johnson, do you think we could visit your house? And he said, no, of course not. I do not allow strangers into my house. And I kind of gave the follow-up questions like, could we walk around the property then? And he said, blank-faced, allowing you into my garden would be the same as allowing you into my house. And we kind of, everyone kind of went blank, and I said, time for us to go and drive the rest 4.5 hours to Princeton. But the point I'm trying to make is that the anecdotes sometimes connect, sometimes become isolated elements, sometimes become forms of thinking about other projects, forms of other connecting experiences. I mentioned that the second building that we got to draw on our first year of architectural education was Stirling Glacier building, a building that both Eisenman talks a lot about, but a building that also Rafael Moneo is especially careful in describing in his course at the GSD. This is a building that still to this day becomes a kind of a canon that allows for multiplicity of readings, whether it is the transformation of glass, something thin, into volumetric qualities, and brick, something which is solid, becoming almost surface. But as Moneo would also say, a kind of a moment in which Stirling was thinking about section before moving up, and he uses a case of the Neustadt Gallery in Stuttgart, moving to plan, and how we shift about our ways of thinking about ways of representation and tools to think about the project. And I was lucky enough to have Rem Koolhaas as a professor that first year at the GSD here next to Ungers, who, as we know, invited him to spend some time in Cornell. But I do think that professors can be moments of epiphany. Professors can produce moments of magic which connect you to certain ideas and preoccupations. Whether Moneo's understanding that the build work speaks for itself, but that the build work is also a sort of a vessel for different ideas, whether to think about your own project, such as is in Remarks on 21 Works, or whether it is to think about the work of his colleagues. And here's where the notion of the canon, when we look at that biography, is something about how do we relate to what's happening at the same time in our world, and how do we relate it to the work we did before and the work we want to keep on doing. But let me go back to the plan, because at least in the planning discipline, for many years, when we talked about plans, it was usually a white man with a stick pointing to a large model or standing in a red beam in front of a city he destroyed or transformed, or a little bit of both, or a carefully imaged photograph of the hand of the architect in front of a project that would have torn and destroyed half of the Paris we know today. So this idea, and I think this was kind of Rem's contribution to think about Mexico City beyond the idea of the physical environment. What are the constituent factors that produce a city? Not only its iconic architecture, but what are really the forces driving the city? And after after 1.5 years in Harvard, as if that wasn't enough, I decided to return to do a Doctor of Design, in which my dissertation was about informality, urban informality. Because I discovered that when you look at the city, and which is the same for almost every underdeveloped city, over half the cities are being produced, as we saw from Felix in the case of Nairobi in Kenya. They're being produced outside the traditional regimes, protocols, and systems of thinking about architecture, planning, and design. They're unregulated, they're semi-planned. We can discuss about that. But what does it mean for the disciplines of design and architecture and planning to imagine that half the production of what we imagine and constitute our subject matter, namely the city, is happening elsewhere? And how do we relate those processes to challenge our own techniques about thinking about new narratives, new toolboxes, and new ways of being effective and creating a sense of agency? 2000, I returned to Mexico, and I worked with Alberto Calach in his barely established urbanistic office within his Taller de Arquitectura. Alberto, probably the most important Mexican alumni from Cornell. And this, again, not to kind of make the fine point, but I mentioned today that the shadow that this institution casts, the footprint that it has been able to do and to change and to touch and to sort of create ideas and processes of innovation is incredibly rich, and I think that legacy needs to continue and to adapt and to be also critically assessed. And in 2002, when we opened our office, I think that one of the most important parts is how do we create an environment where our own take, we were in our mid-30s, allow us to think about the sort of the limits and the failure of the discipline, and to think about how architecture can construct new ways of working. This is a comic strip from Mafalda, Argentinian cartoonist Kino. Good morning, girl. Can I speak with a boss of the family? In this family, there are no bosses. We're a co-op. And she closes the door. Actually, the last strip is like, oh, well, the sales manual did not have all the answers to every, did not have all the questions to every possible answer. And we started thinking of an office, how could we become almost like an infrastructure for collaboration? And I would say we have been incredibly lucky to be able to work and collaborate with a multiplicity of offices from all over. Some of our most talented and capable colleagues, both from Mexico and elsewhere. And I do think that's a big shift in terms of our understanding of how practice and how virtuosity, how talent operates. And all these years have been kind of an experiment of how do we devise the processes, how do we devise the forms of representation, whether they're planning books, whether they're drawings or models, to think about some of the concerns we have in a discipline. And this is something that we are finally, and I say finally and hopefully knock on wood, putting together in a publication that we hope to have by next year. And this is a book of 11 essays and concerns and preoccupations about the discipline and the way it relates to the world. And I will talk about a few of them. And one of them, if I was saying that sometimes the anecdotes or the work relates to previous work, but also to the work that someone else is doing, to the contingencies of our time, to what's happening outside the discipline, to an article that you wrote maybe 15 years ago and suddenly becomes relevant because you're understanding a force that was not evident at the time, and you wrote about it and suddenly becomes a project. And it's kind of a strange history of anecdotes and coincidences about serendipities in which the work begins to accumulate, about moments in which you happen to give a tour to a couple of professors from London School of Economics, and a few months later, you're taking some of the most important urban scholars to visit the informal settlements of Mexico City, which become the beginning of an incredible friendship and collaboration with people like Ricky Burdett or Saskia Sassen or Richard Sennett. But then you end up visiting those same places, whether in Joburg or in Cape Town, or whether in Mumbai, with your peers and people that can show you kind of the shared knowledge. And that turns into processes of thinking about the processes of planning. What's missing? What are we not understanding in terms of how we plan, design, and transform the city? And as Ungers would say, it's always about the block, it's always about the building. We sometimes need to use those understandings of the block and the building, but also about the open space and the programming. But even if you take it further, the act of planning becomes a way of imagining processes of financial allocation, power allocation, and decision making. So the act of design, the act of planning is not pointing to a big model in the city, but actually about allocating resources. And to regulate those resources and regulate power, we tend to underestimate the possibilities of zoning, at least from the fields of architecture, something which is perfectly natural in the fields of planning. But zoning is an incredible force that we actually took it in a kind of more critical and engaged way. We could produce far more relevant narratives, which, by the way, is the way that both public policy and the real estate industry needs to operate. And in this previous project we did with SHOP, and this one with Sasaki, this is a master plan in León, Guanajuato. More than even the images, or more than the formal decisions about the city, again, whether it is block or tower, whether it is plinth or slab buildings, probably the most relevant lessons is about how do we connect those formal decisions and physical decisions with the social and the political capacity for architecture and for planning to make a difference. Again, whether it is a health district in Mexico City, or whether it is an urban housing district. And if one connects and starts to talk at informality for many years, at some point someone will ask you, well, what would you do if you have the capacity to imagine new processes of housing? And that's a connection that connects, that links informality, not only in terms of urban dwelling improvement, which is something that we have done in a number of projects, manuals of self-building, but imagining new ways of density and understanding why is the world of architecture, planning, and real estate unable to compete with that production of informality. And of course, the questions of housing are bringing out the bigger issues that have to do with affordability, but even with urban policy. Both in Mexico, the new president, Claudia Sheinbaum, has announced the construction of 1 million affordable social housings. In the case of the US, at least one candidate has talked about 4 million new homes. Why aren't we, the schools of architecture, addressing this through the disciplinary techniques we have to raise our hands and say, you know, we have something to say about affordability. We have something to say about regulation of digital platforms. This is the newspaper El País, just past week, the supplement on the first page on the great crisis of housing, even on the context of Europe, where this has been, housing has been kind of an incredible part of the welfare state. The question is not only how do we recognize housing as a human right, which no one argues against, but at the same time we deal with the fact that housing is an asset, and housing is a commodity, and housing represents a way of creating wealth for a multiplicity of people, and not only evil Wall Street real estate investment trust. And we need to overcome that narrative and tell through drawings, through better presentations, the ecosystems of producing housing. And sometimes by just telling the same story that we seem all to know in a more creative, in a more eloquent, in a more elegant fashion, allows you to access to conversations that begin to create traction, and that begin to put you in the context of creating a sense of agency. And this for the past 10 years, we've been fortunate enough to connect that reading we had of Ciudad Neza, of the biggest slum in Mexico City, and how that informal housing was produced, to the fact of imagining how do we do urban blocks and produce a sense of affordability for a 35,000 US dollars, 60 square meter unit. And unless we understand the sense of the drivers of how affordability and how the real estate market and how the regulations operate, we're condemned to be throwing rocks from outside the window. And we've been fortunate enough to kind of not only sort of do the internal work that has to do with morphology and typology, to tell the narratives about historical preservation, in this case opening up a plaza between two heritage listed buildings, and at the same time adapt the FAR and FOT to produce the expectations of profit that a real estate developer requires, but at the same time imagining how the new evolution of multifamily housing is bringing on a new narrative to Mexico. These are two buildings in Guadalajara, where the question of non-ownership and producing a form of affordability, a kind of affordability through rental, which, by the way, let's not fool ourselves, this is still middle class or lower to middle class. This is owned by CCLA, which is a subsidiary of CIM out of LA and New York City. This is a project we did with a Productora, but ones in which we can simultaneously try to work from within the discipline, the plan, the section, the materiality, the affects that a building is creating, the way we think about shadows, the way we think about environmental performance, but also simultaneously to tell the narratives and understand the narratives of where do we put the budget? Where do we create that sense of, if housing is a right, rights are propaganda unless they're connected to budgets, and budgets need to be spatially allocated. Do we put it in a better material, or do we put it in more square meters? Do we put it in amenities, or do we put it in public space? And the first time we sat with one of these real estate developers, a home builder that every year built 30,000 units of housing in Mexico City, usually with one or two typologies. And the first time that we plastered his wall with 60 ways of resolving the 60-meter building, suddenly there was an eureka moment for him. And obviously for us, because it created the opportunity to produce more than 3,000 new units for him. And I do think that housing, because it's such a contested topic, requires both work and conversations that are disciplinary and work and conversations that extend beyond the discipline. To be able to simultaneously think about the tectonics and exactly the layout of each of the bricks in one of these buildings in Guadalajara, but simultaneously to think of how they will relate to approvals, how we tell a narrative about rezoning, or how we tell stories about possibilities of affordability. We have, for the past 20 years, we have been working strongly on the questions of cultural and social infrastructure. And I just want to kind of move, and this is kind of my Stirling moment in one of our early competitions, the first important competition that we won for the Spanish Cultural Center a project in the historical center of Mexico City, where we won the competition without designing a facade, avoided doing a facade in a context in which everyone was concerned about how does the building adapt to the context. And we decided to do this, the technique is all about the section, because we thought that the contingencies and the contested capacity of a facade to create a discussion in an architectural competition is usually like a yay or nay situation. And if you understand the system of a narrative of a competition in which you care more about organization, you care more about programming, you care more about integration with an existing building, you can procrastinate on the decision about the facade long enough to fool someone. And I think that strategy actually was quite useful in working in many other projects. Initially, more in the traditional, I say, cultural or museum-like institutions, such as our work for the Sala de Arte Público Siqueiros, or the former house studio of the artist Siqueiros, in which our work is literally just tearing down 2 walls and opening up the former garage to the murals that Siqueiros had built and had painted to be exposed to the city again. And it had to do with a conceptual connection of the garage, the kind of painting that Siqueiros was using, which was automotive painting, and to the idea and the absolute belief that public art and muralist art was a public the domain, and to actually bring the mural into the sidewalk was simultaneously a political and an act of public space making. So sometimes the square footage of architecture becomes about selective demolition and not construction. Later on with the Centro Cultural Elena Garro, about preservation and reframing. But most recently, and probably more interesting for us, are the social infrastructure of the Pilares. 600-meter units, less than $1.5 million in budget. That's less than half that what the stairs at Sibley Hall will cost to remodel. But we're managing to take into this policy of the former mayor and now president of the country, which is how do we distribute a multiplicity, in this case over 300 small interventions of $1 million to produce a different kind of welfare for the city. And we were lucky enough to design 2 of them. This is Valentín Gómez Farías, in which both the programming, both the spatial qualities, we were concerned about how the building becomes an infrastructure for a different kind of public life, not necessarily available today. Whether in Iztapalapa, a former industrial and notably informal settlement, or the case of a different kind of facility such as the one in Benito Juárez, more of a middle class community. And sometimes, again, the question of how do you allocate the resources and where do you put the budget, and how do you construct both the simplicity of something that can be done under the challenges of budget and political times, but at the same time become the facilitators of a different kind of public life, which did not exist necessarily in this neighborhood. And of course, we do care about the plans, because there's a moment, this is simultaneously our Nationalist Gallery kind of grafting, but our moment of how do you deal in a context of a semi-oblique or parallelogram kind of site in which the building could produce this set of triangles that relate both to the history of sheds in the area, but also to the way of occupying that space. And mobility has been a different venture ourselves, in which, because we are aware that when we talk about cities, it's not about fixed environments, it's not only about the fair ground, but about the way that cities have become kind of labor markets. The ways of inequity and the ways of injustices are very much embedded in the way people move and access to jobs, to the education, to housing, and to services. And there's not a week in which we cannot find a moment in which the problems of mobility are becoming public problems. And how do we, as architects, as planners, as designers, engage these questions? And of course, probably Mexico is not the best poster child to talk about success in mobility. We have 22 million trips every day, and a large amount of the population spend more than 3 hours commuting to work. So the act of imagining and the act of reducing those commuting times, the act of improving the experience of moving the city, of creating and changing the modal split so that more people moving public transportation, is also a kind of creating justice. And in a similar situation with a kind of a housing narrative, the mobility narrative came out of giving many lectures about Ciudad Neza. And after one of those lectures, a person approached to us and said, so you know about Ciudad Neza because we're starting a mobility project in Ciudad Neza, maybe you can help us decide that. So as we say in Spanish, you never know where the rabbit is gonna jump. So you must be aware of how you put yourself in those circumstances, conversations, tables, meals, or intellectual discussions. And although the first BRT line had already been built in Mexico City, this was a line in which, a 14-kilometer long line in which we were able to bring in a cycleway and we were able to do some form of improvement. So the non-housing episode of transforming Neza is actually far more effective than building housing in Neza, because in Neza, the housing is being built by the citizens themselves. The infrastructure is very difficult to do bottom-up infrastructure. So this took us in 2014 to the Audi Urban Future Award, in which by visualizing the possibilities of understanding long-term commutes, the position of housing, and to understand that mobility is a social contract with stakeholders, with different platforms and protocols, but also with opportunities, there's a chance to imagine and transform mobility in a radical way. And in the past 10 years, we have finished 3 more BRT lines, always improving on the previous project, always learning from the mistakes of the previous project, because in mobility, the most important rule is the role of unintended consequences. The things you plan are not necessarily the outcomes that are created. And whether it is the accessibility for cyclists and pedestrians, such as covering an urban highway to produce a new plaza in Mexico City, or producing a ferry system of water mobility in Acapulco, or an intermodal hub in Mexico City, our work understands that mobility becomes an incredible tool for social transformation and change. And in some of these cases, which are some of them public-led and some of them privately-led, we operate as kind of a double agent, which is an idea I will talk about in a second. But this possibility to understand that urbanistic work, housing work, and mobility work are happening simultaneously, and that if you think of them in a transversal way, you can actually radically transform the lives of millions of people. And our most recent project is the Va-y-Ven, which is the complete restructuring of the mobility system. Every single line, every single trajectory, the physical infrastructures and the physical design, the selection of the buses, and the image and name of the system, Va-y-Ven, which is like come and go, has improved mobility and become a sort of a benchmarking for mobility in Mexican cities. And sometimes the work, and when we look at even the stations, the tiny bus stops probably become the least interesting and important aspect of that. And I think that you could look at it in a sense of sadness, but also empowering of how the decisions and how our intellect and how our power and leverage sometimes operates different. Very briefly to kind of move along, similar situation, and I talked about this earlier on, about how our obsessions sometimes become the way to think about ideas. And food, not only as an individual concern of obsession, there's Anthony Bourdain talking about eating as a kind of a failure and success. You need to eat bad a lot of times before you find the right place. And that relates much to the work we do as designers and planners. We iterate, we transform, but also food and the city is also very much about space and time. It's about logistics. It's about the challenges of our time. It's about climate change, but it is also about objects and accumulation of experiences. And for 3 years, I was sponsored to do a research project called On Food and the City. And for 3 years, I thought and researched about not only the history of the kitchen and the history of how food, the way that our artifacts related to food production, distribution, and consumption have shaped space, have shaped cities. And again, you end up giving lectures about these processes that at some point some chef asks you, well, you're a foodie, you seem to know a thing about food, why don't you design our restaurant, the first two-star Michelin restaurant in Mexico City, Quintonil, which we worked with Jorge Vallejo and Ale Flores, but then later be commissioned to do the transformation of the Central de Abastos, the wholesale market, sort of retrofitting the roofs, which were designed as parking, turning them into energy generating solar panels and community gardens, but also creating a Ciudad Abasto, or a campus for that community of hundreds of thousands of people that come to the wholesale market every day. And you participate in a competition that you lose, you end up in third place, but that become the seed for new forms of planning, forms of asking the right questions, of developing the strategies, the operations, and the actions, but most of all, to actually listening to the citizens and what they have to say about the transformation of the neighborhood. And actually, we were the only one of the finalist teams in actually asking citizens what and how do they envision their transformation of their neighborhood. But to visualize and to understand that the protocols of designing, planning, and acting, to imagine that the incremental accumulation of decisions is an act of design as well, an act of things in the making, became if that project was not implemented, became the segue to being hired to transform the market of San Juan, the most important gastronomic market in Mexico City. A tiny operation of changing the facade, bringing more light to the interior, and changing infrastructure. But most of all, to working with 700 sellers, each of them which had their own voice about how the market should be working. And later on to again be asked by other chefs to think about how do we think about comfort food and a place where you could eat 24 hours a day and have a connection with a community and a sense of understanding the role that food plays in that construction of community. This is Restaurant Laurel for chefs Guillermo González Beristain and Eduardo Morali. And in these kind of digressions, the question of travel and hospitality have also become ways to think about the transformation of space through a different mean. Tourism can be a force of incredible destruction, but has become also a form of economic development for multiplicities of countries. Of course, we also are aware that there's an intimate connection between the form of extractive and even colonialist practices of tourism that are transforming huge swaths of land all over the world. So the question is why kind of a reflexive, critical, engaging architecture cannot have a better voice and a better say in understanding the problems that tourism is creating? Can we understand and assume that that the destructive capacities of tourism could be transformed little by little, and understanding that sometimes tourism can be about low density and local knowledge, that sometimes tourism could be about reclaiming the spaces of a city for a waterfront, that sometimes tourism is not about a five-star hotel, but about creating a new dock and a public pool, and that sometimes it's actually about climbing a couple of stories and look at the horizon in a different way. And this kind of a different narrative of tourism is relevant in a place like Mexico, where we have thousands of kilometers of shore, and where aside from oil and aside from remittances, tourism is the most important force of economic development. Can we have one thing without the other? And can we use the techniques of architecture, just sort of comparing different densities, and to understand the impacts that our actions have as ways to producing more sustainable, more equitable, more inclusive forms of tourism? Can we have our cake and eat it? And it is obviously a question that not always is answered in an effective way. The architect can be a double agent. The architect sometimes is the useful idiot, but the architect can also serve as a consigliere. Because architecture connects to the larger world, both as a social and political project. It is a political act to do architecture, and to be aware and acknowledge the impacts and the winners and the losers is relevant in that construction of the political project of architecture. Less than 24 hours ago, Mexico City hosted the Bloomberg City Lab Conference with over 120 mayors from all over the world, and an event organized by Bloomberg Philanthropies. Mayor Bloomberg, Patricia Harris, which I just learned is a Cornell graduate, were there. And sometimes we rebuild our sense of agency by putting ourselves in the conversations and creating narratives about sense of relevance. This is on the way out. This is the new elected mayor of Mexico City, Clara Brugada, who implemented some of the most interesting and relevant social infrastructure in the cities, the utopias and the cableways. But this idea is not always kind of successful. Not always are we Trojan horses able to come in and transform from within. Sometimes we become useful idiots. Sometimes our narratives are not positive enough to create that sense of change. One of such projects in which we are simultaneously sort of happy to be able to finish it, but simultaneously concerned about the limits and the problematic it creates, is the Mayan train, a project of radical infrastructure in the Yucatan Peninsula. So there's, on the one hand, there's something to celebrate about the production of infrastructure, but there's something to criticize when processes are not taken into account, communities are ignored, and you end up designing against all odds a station 6 miles away from the community it's supposed to serve. So architecture is complicit in these acts, and sometimes we win some, sometimes we lose some. And some people, as kind of Anna Miljaki in her podcast, I prefer not to, bring out the question of when should we as architects be saying no to specific kind of commissions. And I think that it does not pass in an uncareful way. because these issues will present themselves every way, whether polemical projects of infrastructure or even addressing the problems of reconstruction and climate crisis. This is Acapulco, Guerrero, which in less than 10 months has received the double whammy of 2 hurricanes, not one, but 2 hurricanes, October of 2023, and now September of 2024, which became the double punch to destroy a territory of a city which the idea of the jet set, people commuting for the weekend from LA to the most important destination in the Western Hemisphere for tourism in the 1950s and 60s, is absolutely destroyed. And we have been hired by a Mexican entrepreneur and philanthropist to develop a vision for the reconstruction and to understand what failed, how do we work to produce not only the reconstruction of an environment, but to develop a technique of planning which can produce a resilient and more robust urban environment, where 3/4 of the population work in forms associated to the products of tourism. And this is an important project for us because it's not only an incredible collaboration with Gabriela Carrillo and her Colectivo C733, which recently won the Obel Award, and with Taller Capital of Jose Pablo Ambrosi and Loretta Castro. But it is a way to test the possibilities of architecture and planning at multiplicities of scale, of developing techniques that have to do with community engaging, with telling new narratives, with producing new inclusionary ways of bringing in stakeholders, to find alternative ways of financing, to develop individual techniques and projects which can be incrementally developed and do not necessarily become the only ever top-down impossible project to implement. But one in which there's also kind of a possibility for cherry picking from politicians who need to decide priorities, who understand the political and social complexities of a site. So it is an urbanism of accumulated projects, but it is also an urbanism of accumulated processes, and one in which the representations, the techniques of approaching and producing a sense of agency and relevance is still quite relevant. Yesterday, and believe it or not, this is not my final lecture of the day, because at 10 p.m. I need to connect to present to the new commissioner of Reconstruction what can we do with Acapulco. And to end, what would make someone to come and leave Mexico City here? Let me start by connecting it to small obsessions that have to do with the possibility of performing. In an article in the New York Times in 2011, Maria Callas is the article about charisma. Maria Callas is explained as a perfect example of how a godlike or divine given gift allows for something magical to happen in a performance. And of course, we can relate or not to contemporary performers. I personally have no problem considering myself a Swiftie, even if I wear a Sonic Youth t-shirt to the Taylor Swift concert. But I do think that there's a moment in performing and a moment of communicating that has to do with the possibility of creating magic, with the possibility of creating a connection, not only through the buildings, but the way we achieve those buildings. Nick Cave is masterful in that, but in a different way and in almost a different technique of creating discomfort. Andy Kaufman, here with David Letterman, early 80s, was able to perform. So these ideas and this concern connect Mexico City to Ithaca. So a city of 21 million people, when you can have amazing jacarandas, perfect weather during the year, great food, amazing pastries, incredible restaurants, mezcal, food scene, food tacos, and my own particular house, which I tend to like, and the thing I like the most, which is my own kitchen. Why am I here? I'm beginning to think this is my Elvis Costello moment. Not only are Ithaca and Mexico City connected in the fact that the geology that Caroline students are concerning and representing and addressing and doing beautiful representations with it. Mexico City, an endorheic basin, 2,400 meters above sea level, surrounded by volcanoes, prone to flooding and prone to earthquakes, not that different from the glacial impact that has put a mark on this territory. It is all about the land. It is not about kind of surviving the winters. It's not about dealing with the commutes and the delayed airplanes and the 9 hours. It takes me more time to arrive in Ithaca than to get to Madrid. But it is about you. It is about every one of those students, every one of this faculty, everyone in staff who has allowed me to imagine a possible future, a possibility to think of the work I have done and the work that I better keep doing. To imagine, not in a kind of Google Vision or Ray-Ban meta fashion, but in a kind of cyborg device, and this is a 3-minute exercise with Midjourney of a device in which architecture is a way of looking at the world, but a way of reading the world, a way of calibrating the world, about a way of transforming the world. If reading the room is about understanding nuances, physical, verbal and non-verbal language, physical space, maybe we need to start reading the world and expanding our understanding of how we, as the mission of this fantastic institution is, how do we create a better world? Thank you very much. I know I extended, but maybe we can have a few questions before we need to head out.
Gracias. I was thinking about the Abraham Cruz Villegas and like his process of autoconstrucción and this idea of like, but also the plans in your work or the planning, but I'm wondering about unrealized work that you are, there's like an obsession and delineating and connecting points. And I think unrealized architecture or art remains in the planning stages, or I'm wondering if there's something about your practice or that you've followed in the planning on the unrealized.
I think that in a kind of a maybe simplistic dichotomy between the preoccupations of the planning and the preoccupations of the architectural discipline, architecture tends to be more obsessed about outcomes, again, the solitude of the building and what it does, and versus the success of the process, the success of the balancing of power, the reallocation of decision making. I think, and I'm a big fan of not only Cruz Villegas, but a whole tradition of artists dealing with these preoccupations about process and informality and materiality. I think that we need to overcome the notion that success is strictly connected to the idea of the built. That every idea, every drawing, every representation, every failure can become part of that canon, part of that tentative canon, that part of that possibility of a broader piece of work. Nima, brace for impact.
Jose, thank you for a wonderful lecture and for allowing us a peek into your world. I think, including your kitchen, which I've heard so much about. So thank you for that. I was wondering if you can talk a little bit more about pedagogy. I mean, you've taught for many years now, and I think behind all those projects and collaborations, there's a pedagogy at work. And so wondering if you could talk more about that.
I don't know if I have been too effective or not effective at all at understanding that there's a continuum between the pedagogical, the academic, and intellectual concerns I do have with the way they connect to our own practices. So sometimes the horse pulls the cart, and sometimes the cart pushes the horse, if I may use that. And in many cases, I'll put two examples. My preoccupation with informality, which is initially sort of academic, which became a series of pedagogical courses and even the housing studios that I did, which concern a topic I saw as relevant to the discipline, became techniques of saying, can we do better? Can we represent? Can we conceptualize? Can we theorize on this subject matter in a different way? Which later became, when I say real, let's say professional projects. I do think that the idea that architecture is a way to look at the world, and that sometimes these lenses allow us to see better when we're close or better when we're looking far. I think that pedagogy is a way of producing those multiple prosthetics, let me use that word. And sometimes it's related to the tools. I could not feel anything but envy after seeing the 4 presentations today. And I joke with someone at the advisory council, I wish I could be a student for 6 weeks again and kind of have that capacity to absorb. I think that the pedagogy, and here's connect with the ways that sometimes, I think I mentioned this in the piece that Alix and her team wrote in the Cornell newsletter, is that pedagogy, rather than that kind of more tyrannical approach in which some of us were raised a few decades ago, I think that pedagogy becomes a space between what everyone brings to the table. And to understand that space, not unlike charisma, in the article about charisma, and let me connect this with the pedagogy, we tend to overvalue virtuosity and talent, but virtuosity and talent does not produce the magic necessary to transfer knowledge. And I do think, and I'm concerned, and there's no formula, on how does one produce those elements of moments of magic. Of course, repetition is one of them. Of course, benchmarking is one of them. Of course, representation is one of them. Of course, is a kind of understanding and acting in a reflexive way. And of course, critical histories is one of them. So I think and I believe in a school in which the techniques to approach the pedagogies necessary for the challenges of our times are absolutely pluralistic rather than simultaneously convergent and limited in scope. Thank you very much.